In 10 days, Canadians officially go off to the polls to choose a leader and a political party that will govern for the next 4 to 5 years. Although pre-voting actually begins today, and I'm going to be taking advantage of that as soon as we wrap up. Over the past 2 days, we've had the French language and the English language leaders debate. The French language debate was on Wednesday evening, and then the English language debate was last night on Thursday, both recorded in Montreal. I'd like to talk today a little bit about some of the issues that were covered, the responses of the leaders. But first, let's say a little bit about the parties that actually participated. There were four political parties that were represented in the leaders' debate: the Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre; the Liberal Party, led by Mark Carney, who has now filled in after the departure of Justin Trudeau; the New Democratic Party, led by Jagmeet Singh; and the Bloc Québécois, led by Yves-François Blanchet. For our non-Canadian viewers, and even for some Canadian viewers, there in previous debates, there have been as many as six leaders, six parties represented. There were two parties that were not invited this time around. One is the People's Party of Canada, and the other is the Green Party. Now, about a month ago, the organizers of the debates announced that the participating leaders and parties would have to meet at least two of three criteria. One is to have members of parliament sitting in the House of Commons. The other is to have representatives in a minimum of 90% of ridings. And the other is to have a minimum of 4% in the public opinion polls. Now, the People's Party of Canada weren't invited because they didn't meet any of those criteria. The Green Party invitation was rescinded at the last moment. Now this is very interesting because the Green Party, they do have members of Parliament sitting in the House, and originally they'd announced that they were going to be running candidates in 90% of ridings. But more recently, for various strategic reasons, they cut down the number of candidates to only 70%, which means, and they're polling at less than 4%, which means they're factually and objectively not qualified to participate in the debate. Now, one could question why they were uninvited at the last moment. That's a little bit strange, but sure enough, they did not meet the criteria. And I found it interesting that in the two leaders of the party, in their public statement, rather than taking responsibility and saying, yeah, we messed up, we didn't meet the criteria. Instead, they were quite immature and they complained and saying, this is undemocratic, we're being silenced, we're being oppressed. Anyway, that tells you how seriously the Green Party should be taken in this country. Now, at this point, you may ask, well, what about the Bloc Québécois? The Bloc Québécois is a very interesting party. It's a francophone, a Quebec-based party, which only runs candidates in the province of Quebec. So they actually had even fewer candidates than the Green Party, which is interesting. However, they do have members of parliament sitting in the House of Commons, and they are currently polling at slightly higher than 4% because Quebec is a very, very large province. So for that reason, the Bloc Québécois was represented in the two leaders' debates. And this was very interesting. And for our American viewers, let me give you an analogy. Suppose that you had a US federal debate where the three parties participating were the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and let's say, California First Party, which only runs candidates in California and which spent the whole time talking only about the interests of Californians. That kind of gives you an idea of what we were dealing with the Bloc Québécois. Why was the Bloc Québécois participating in this debate? For comic relief, I don't know. Almost every time Monsieur Blanchet opened his mouth, it was to talk about Quebec's interests, Quebec first. He doesn't seem interested at all in what's going on in the rest of Canada. Indeed, at one point, he even said, I have no desire to be the leader of this country. And yet he's standing on the stage alongside the conservative, liberal, and new democratic leaders. I don't get it either. Nonetheless, so we had four parties represented by the four leaders, and there were slightly different topics covered on the two evenings, the French and English debate. Now, there were a few topics which did come up on both evenings. The first topic that came up in both debates was Donald Trump and the tariffs, which seem to be in the news. They seem to be on everybody's mind. Cost of living and affordability, and climate and energy. Those were the topics which came up in both the French and the English debates. Other topics that came up were immigration, public safety and violent crime, etc. And I'm going to say a little bit about each of those topics and what the leaders had to say. But first, I'd like to say a little bit about the format of the debate itself. So the debates were structured along these major topics. There were 6 major topics for each of the 2 debates. And for each topic, the leaders were asked a series of questions. Each of the 4 leaders was asked a question, and then there was an open debate portion where they would interact with each other and agree or disagree with one another. One problem that I had with the opening statement portions of each topic is that the leaders' responses were generally limited to a minute or 45 seconds. And this is a problem because it meant that the leaders were basically communicating to Canadian people in sound bites, rather than in a sense they were explaining what they were going to do. They were presenting their promises, but without necessarily giving the reasons for their promises. I see this as a serious problem because how do you judge a political candidate? The way you should judge a political candidate is by his ideas, his ideology, the ideas that he represents. Politicians make promises all the time. How often do they actually keep these promises? The promises that a candidate makes don't necessarily tell you what he's going to do, what his party is going to do when they're in office. Because frankly, political parties and political leaders make contradictory promises. They make promises that are antithetical. For example, a leader like the Jagmeet Singh of the New Democrats will say, I'm going to raise taxes on the wealthy. I'm going to close tax loopholes. And I'm going to improve the economy. Or a leader will say, I'm going to improve the tax burden on the middle class. I'm going to lower taxes. But at the same time, I'm going to build more homes and I'm going to hire more doctors and nurses. And you have to ask, well, which is it? Which are you going to do? It's either one or the other. You can't accomplish all these goals. And to understand what a political leader is going to do, you have to go beyond the sound bites, beyond the promises, which are essentially vacuous, and look at what are this leader's priorities? What is most important to this leader? And to know that, you have to know something about his underlying ideology. And in a debate, you get little glimmers of that, but really you need to seek out other sources of information. So actually, over the past few weeks, I've watched some long format interviews with Pierre Poilievre that he did with Jordan Peterson and others over the years. I've read the first few chapters of Mark Carney's book entitled Values. And those sources, long format podcasts, books written by the candidates, that tells you quite a bit more about what that leader is actually going to do when he's in office. Unfortunately, most Canadians are going to get their impression of these leaders from the little sound bites that they get over the course of the campaign and from watching the debates. So one of the things I'm going to try to explain is what we can actually learn from the candidates by their responses to these various topics and various questions. Okay, so the first topic that was on everybody's minds in both the French and the English debates was Donald Trump and the tariffs. Few interesting things came up. All the leaders stressed the importance of Canadian unity, of Canada presenting a strong front in opposition to the various attacks, economic and other attacks by President Donald Trump. And there was a lot of discussion of, for example, with regards to the tariffs, is it wise to match the US tariffs with dollar for dollar tariffs? One thing that Mark Carney said, which I agree with, is he said we should not match the US with dollar for dollar tariffs. Rather, that our tariffs should be strategic. They should be targeted in such a way that they do maximum damage to the US economy, but minimum damage to the Canadian economy. Unfortunately, Mr. Carney didn't go into detail as to what he meant by that. What would it mean to have strategic or targeted tariffs? I would have liked to have known a little bit more than that about that. Now, obviously, I would say that tariffs are bad however you do them, because they're essentially a tax on one's own citizens. When you tax US imports, it minimizes the choices that Canadians can make in terms of the kinds of purchases that they can make, but also it minimizes what Americans are able to buy from Canadians. So it actually ends up harming citizens on both sides of the border. Nobody made that point. Nobody really challenged whether tariffs as such are a good thing for the economy. Everybody seems to take for granted, yeah, Donald Trump is putting tariffs on us. We have to match them with our own tariffs. Now, one question which was asked on the Wednesday night French language debate, which I thought was a particularly stupid question, but I'll mention it here. The moderator asked, what US products have you stopped purchasing? He asked each of the candidates, and they mentioned, U.S. alcohol, beer and wine, U.S. beef, whatever. I'm just buying Canadian beef. I found this a little bit irritating because over the past few weeks or past few months, there's been so much nationalistic, very narrow sort of nationalistic sentiments on both sides of the board, but particularly on the Canadian side. I've made this point in previous discussions. I really think that Donald Trump is a distraction. Yes, of course, we do have to take steps to improve the Canadian economy to meet that economic threat. But I think just focusing too much on Donald Trump's rhetoric has taken attention away from other more important issues. Actually, I thought one of the few sensible comments that came from Monsieur Blanchet of the Bloc Québécois was he said, look, in 3.5 years, there's going to be another president in the White House. We can't be focusing over much on Donald Trump. We have no control over Trump. We have no control over his actions, his rhetoric. That's basically true. And I thought that was one of the more sensible points coming from the leader of the Bloc Québécois. On the subject of affordability and cost of living, now this was something that came up again and again, particularly from Mr. Poilievre, the Conservative Party leader. He talked a lot about how over the past 10 years, Canada has done very poorly economically. We've had the lowest growth rate of all G7 countries. We've gone from being essentially on par in terms of per capita GDP, essentially on par with the United States back in 2015, to a point where now each Canadian earns approximately 60 cents to the dollar of what our American counterparts earn. And Mark Carney had a lot of impressive sounding rhetoric about how he's going to invest in Canada, how he's going to invest in Canadian technology, Canadian industries, how he's going to improve the economy. Mark Carney was one of Justin Trudeau's economic advisors. Of course, Chrystia Freeland was the finance minister, so she was probably the main advisor. But Mark Carney has been advising Trudeau on economic issues for many, many years during this period that the economy has. And Poilievre pinpointed this and emphasized this numerous times. Poilievre stressed that he would lower taxes, particularly for new home buyers, etc. Now, a couple of interesting points which were made by the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. Jagmeet Singh said that he's going to raise taxes on the wealthy, close tax loopholes. True to his nature as a disciple of Marxist ideology, Jagmeet Singh sees the world as a class struggle. He sees Canadian society as a struggle between the rich and the poor, between corporations and consumers. Another point that Jagmeet Singh made, which was extremely irritating, and I'm disappointed that nobody challenged him on this point, is on the subject of affordability and that grocery prices are going up, which is absolutely true. Grocery prices have been going up over the last few years. Jagmeet Singh, well, the reason is because of these greedy grocery companies, corporations who are gouging us, who are charging us more for groceries. Now, first of all, that's preposterous. The real reason that all of our expenses are going up is because, particularly during the period of the coronavirus lockdowns, the Liberal government was printing money like crazy, monopoly money, paying people to stay at home and not go to work. When you do that, basic economics, law of supply and demand, the price of everything is going to go up. Unfortunately, none of the leaders made that point. But again, Jagmeet Singh is going to blame the corporations, he's going to blame companies. And his solution is that we should have a cap on grocery prices. Now, it should be obvious to most viewers of this channel that any attempt at government of controlling prices, driving prices below their market levels, is inevitably going to lead to shortages. That's something that we've seen many times over the past few decades. And but this, again, it's very much in keeping with Mr. Singh's ideology. Although this specific issue didn't come up in the debates, but elsewhere on his campaign tours, Jagmeet Singh has talked about rent controls, about making it impossible for landlords to charge more than a certain amount for rentals of apartments and other properties, which again is invariably going to lead to shortages and going to lead to exacerbate the homelessness problem. But so this ties in with my central problem with these debates is that we're only focused on what the politicians are proposing to do, but not on what are the underlying ideas, the underlying ideologies that are guiding them. And we see this particularly in the case of Jagmeet Singh, who makes promises about how I'm going to fight for the workers, I'm going to fight for the poor, but no detailed discussion of what are the actual ideas that are driving him. On the Wednesday night French language debate, there was some interesting discussion of immigration. This is an interesting topic because actually all four leaders who participated in that debate agree that immigration has been out of control over the past decade. We've had too many new people coming into Canada, and our infrastructure, our economy has simply been unable to deal with this influx of immigrants from various countries. Now, of course, it's Mark Carney's party which has been in power during the past decade. It's Justin Trudeau has been opening our borders and welcoming in people in. Now, all four leaders seem to agree that we need to somehow limit the number of immigrants coming in. But there was no real discussion from any of the parties about how this is going to be done, what standards, what criteria we should be applying. So let me offer some thoughts here. First of all, obviously, I'm in favor of immigration. My parents were immigrants, and I think many Canadians are either first generation or second generation. So immigration is definitely a good thing, but we need a couple of safeguards in place. First of all, we need a way of making sure that the people who are coming into this country are law-abiding and productive citizens, that they're not going to be breaking the law, that they're not going to be a burden on our system, on the welfare system. And that brings me to one serious problem, which of course is the welfare state. The welfare state and immigration are an absolutely deadly combination for any country. When you have people coming in who are going to be on welfare or going to be claiming various benefits, various government programs, that's going to put a considerable burden on all Canadians, the ones who have been living here for a long time, as well as the ones who are coming in. In order to make sure that immigrants can be welcome here, that we can actually welcome immigrants, obviously steps would need to be taken to minimize government programs, minimize the welfare state, make sure that immigrants who come here can stand on their own feet, make sure that we have a robust and resilient economy that is able to accommodate more people who need housing, more people who need hospital, who need access to doctors and nurses. There was very little discussion of that. I was also rather disappointed that on both evenings, there was little discussion, little focused discussion of what actually is wrong with Canada's healthcare system. This is a very serious problem because Canadians are spending hours and hours when they go to the emergency waiting to even see someone, even to see a doctor or a nurse. There have even been some notable cases where people have called for an ambulance and people who have had serious injuries, serious medical problems, who've had to wait many hours even for an ambulance to arrive. Uh, Canadians who are elderly and who are ill often have to wait years or many months, or even sometimes a few years for crucial treatments, crucial surgeries. It's an absolute disaster. The obvious solution here, of course, is that we need more options in terms of free market for healthcare. We need more private clinics, private hospital, private doctors and nurses. Obviously, the political left won't even hear about that. The New Democrats, the liberals, they won't even hear. They won't give people those sorts of choices. This is, I think, possibly a lost opportunity for Mr. Poilievre to say that Canadians need more choices, not just in the economic realm, but specifically with regards to healthcare. I'll say a few things now about foreign policy. There was a little bit of discussion of that issue on both evenings. All the party leaders affirmed that we should support the Ukraine, especially now that the United States seems to be backing away from supporting this very important ally, that we should be supporting the Ukraine, that we should give them military aid, etc. One question that came up is, should we be increasing the amount of aid that we give to the Ukraine? Should we be sending them more money than we currently are? And on this point, I thought Poilievre was a little bit tentative. Now, ultimately, I think yes, Ukraine is an important ally. Yes, we should be supporting them, certainly giving them moral support and non-sacrificial military support. I'm open to discussions about how much financial aid we should be sending them, how much money we should be sending them. To be sure, Canada has lots of problems, and our problems have to come first. But to the extent that we can offer non-sacrificial aid to the Ukraine, I certainly think we should do so. On the question of the situation in the Middle East, now this brings me to one moment in both the French and the English debates, which left me really, really disgusted. In both debates, Jagmeet Singh, again, true to his ideology, and here's where he really showed his true colors. In both debates, Jagmeet Singh made the point that what is going on in Gaza now is a genocide. And he said this repeatedly. Repeatedly, he said, it's a genocide. What's happening in Gaza is a genocide. Nobody actually spoke up to challenge him on this. Well, Mark Carney almost did on the French language debate. He made a sort of mealy mouthed reply to the extent that I would not use that word in a political context. What did he mean by that? I'm not entirely sure. But unfortunately, nobody challenged Jagmeet Singh's use of the word genocide. And this is, I think, significant because in recent years, Canada has been accused of committing genocide against its native people. And you'll notice that these accusations, the accusations of Israel committing genocide against the Palestinians and Canada committing genocide against its native people, they tend to come from the same ideological source. They tend to come from the same root. Frankly, they tend to come from the same people, like Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats. And this is something that has to be challenged and has to be addressed. Now, in the few minutes that we have left, many people are wondering, well, who was the likely leader, the likely winner of these two debates? And here, I think a little bit of good news. My opinion, and from what I've seen of commentary on various websites and various news sources, I would say unequivocally, Pierre Poilievre was the winner of both debates, hands down. He was, he, throughout, he looked at the camera, he spoke with warmth and sincerity. He was, I think, less aggressive and less combative than he has been, for example, in the House of Commons or in some of his rhetoric to the media. He, for the most part, I think he struck a reasonable balance between attacking Mark Carney and the Liberals on the one hand and explaining what he was going to do, what policies he was going to adopt on the other hand. I would have liked to have seen him do a little bit more of the latter and less of the former, but overall, I think he came across well. And for those Canadians who are still undecided, and it seems like quite a lot of Canadians up until a few days ago still considered themselves undecided or uncommitted, I think an honest, unbiased Canadian without preconceptions and watching these debates with an open mind, I think would probably come away and saying, yeah, Poilievre, the Conservatives seem like the best choice. Some people, I've come across some opinions to the effect that Mark Carney was a disaster in the two debates. I don't think that's entirely fair. To be sure, he was evasive in his responses to some questions. He was a little bit vague in terms of specifying how he's going to accomplish certain goals and how he's different from Trudeau, how he's going to distance himself from his predecessor. But under the circumstances, given that he's been prime minister for only a month, given that he was frequently being attacked by the other three leaders on the stage, I think he did as well as could be expected. He's not particularly personable or particularly, he doesn't come across as particularly warm. He didn't look at the camera very much. And at times he sort of looks like a bored aristocrat. Why am I on stage with these people? Why am I answering these questions? I'm too good for this. Sometimes he does come across that way. But again, on balance, I think we can expect to see the conservatives rising in the polls over the next few days. One last comment that I'd like to make, and this is again something a little bit positive. Both before the two debates and after the two debates, the four leaders were posing for the cameras, shaking hands, and all the candidates began their opening statements, their opening remarks by thanking each other for participating in the debates. I think this is something very important. When we look south of the border and see how rancorous American politics have become, I think there's something very important in seeing that Canadian leaders can still be civil and can still behave like gentlemen in the way they relate to each other. And so that overall left me with a rather positive impression. So takeaways from the debates. The debates were a little bit tedious. Again, I'm not sure why the Bloc Québécois are even participating. And really, Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats have become basically irrelevant. Frankly, the Liberals under Trudeau have taken on almost all the aspects of the New Democrats' platform, including their opposition to fossil fuels, their opposition to oil and gas, their obsession with clean energy or green energy. Well, again, we can see how well that's worked in Germany and England and other countries. But overall, the debates were civil and polite. I think Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives have come out on top after their performance in both debates. So hopefully there's still some hope left for Canada. Now, I have one other point that I want to make, but before we do that, let's briefly turn to our producer, Daniel, and ask, do we have any interesting questions, comments, or super chats from our viewers?
We have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. And a super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much. I would just only mention, and I think somebody mentioned it in the chat, about the idea of sort of targeting tariffs or sort of what Carney was talking about, more specific tariffs. I think one thing that was talked about is targeting Republican states, basically making sure that if those are the ones that are being targeted the worst, that gives Trump's a bit, and Trump already stepped down from the tariffs, right? So it's only 10% right now.
But they paused. He paused the
Well, yeah.
tariffs, but it's still a little bit open about what he's going to do in the months to come. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that point. Last thought. Please remember that in a free country, voting is, while important, it's not the primary issue. It's a secondary issue. Really, with the election of a new party, and at this point, we don't know. Are the Liberals going to win? Are the Conservatives going to win? Are we going to have a minority government, a majority government? We don't know. One way or the other, what we need to see is a more informed public and a more active, a more politically active public. Even if best case scenario, Polyev wins, he's still going to need the support of sensible, well-informed Canadians. So that means we have to keep speaking up about important issues, whether it's writing op-eds, communicating with our representatives, writing letters to our MPs, or speaking out in whatever large or small forum we may have. The worst thing that can possibly happen is that Canadian people are going to, after the election and after we've chosen a new leader and a new party, that Canadians are going to become passive and say, okay, now I can sit back and let our representatives take over. No, we always have to be informed about what's going on in politics, and we need to be as active as we can. So with that, I'm going to go out right now and vote Conservative. Thank you all very much.